Before I get started with today's episode, I want to talk to you briefly about the first official sponsor of the Unresolved podcast, which is, of course, Harry's. Harry's is a company started by two guys, Jeff and Andy, who were fed up with paying a premium price for generic razors. They started their own company over 4 years ago, and have since then made shaving better for millions of men and women around the world. If you head to harrys.com/unresolved, you could try out their razors for free. That's right, for free. This free trial set includes a weighted, ergonomic razor handle with a textured grip, a high-performance razor made of 5 German-engineered steel blades, rich lathering shave gel, and a travel blade cover. I know I've told this story before, but this offer doesn't only extend to you fellas out there. Harry's provides great razors regardless of gender, and ever since I started buying Harry's razors, my wife has begun stealing my new blades before I could even use them. Once again, you could get this free trial offer while supporting the podcast by heading to harrys.com/unresolved. In 1986, with Madani Bouhouche awaiting trial for the murder of Juan Mendez, the investigation into finding the Brabant Killers continued. It had now been almost half a decade since the crime spree began. And even though the violent bandits had not struck in almost 2 years, that did not give the public any peace of mind. After all, they had disappeared between 1983 and 1985, and then resurfaced to be even more violent than before. Who knew what they would be like if they came back with early 1990s firepower? Law enforcement, feeling the pressure, split the main investigation into 2 separate parties. One of which was in Charleroi, a French-speaking district south of Brussels. The other was Dendermonde, an area north of Brussels that spoke Dutch. This was supposed to not only unite both halves of the country behind a common cause, but to inspire new ideas and theories. Within the first year, there were some positive results. The northern team in Dendermonde, headed by Magistrate Freddy Troke, was rewarded with a find in the forested area where the Brabant Killers had abandoned their vehicle. If you recall, in the aftermath of their final crime in Alst, they had headed to a wooded area to burn their car and dump a duffel bag full of weapons and ammo into the water. This is where an eyewitness recalled seeing a large body lying on the ground, leading to theories that one of the gunmen, possibly the Giant, had been killed or seriously wounded in their last firefight. In one of the canals, the investigative teams found a bag full of weapons. This was in November of 1986, almost an entire year after the final assault, leading to conspiracy theories that the bag had been purposefully placed there or planted by law enforcement. However, most usually dismiss these theories as mindless gossip, and I'm inclined to agree with their dismissal. The guns provide a direct link between several of the Brabant Killer crimes, linking them together. This is also when police made a direct correlation between the violent assaults on grocery stores with many of the other senseless murders, including Jose van den Einde in 1982, Angelou Constantine in 1983, and Jean and Marie Sy-Music in the latter half of 1983. Before this, there were only tentative ties linking them together in any way. With this find, police were one step closer to catching the Brabant Killers. But just like most developments in unsolved cases, being one step closer usually means that there's a pending 2-step backslide. Following the findings of the Dendermonde team in November of 1986, police were eager to continue their hunt for the Brabant Killers. With the discovery of this weapons trove, they seemed to be closer than ever. The team behind the Dendermonde find proposed a joint task force, which would join them up with the French-speaking Charleroi investigation. This way, they would be able to pool resources, and instead of having to split time with other investigations, be able to focus exclusively on finding the Brabant Killers. However, this proposal was turned down by higher-ups in the government, with many theorizing that the Minister of the Justice Department himself rejected the offer. In 1988, a parliamentary commission began. This commission, an independent collection of politicians that wished to get to the bottom of this issue, began publishing info about the case in various formats. Most of this information is still readily accessible in an easy-to-follow web format at killersbrabant.be. If you're like me, you may need to use a translation service to view that, but those that understand either Dutch or French can look at some of the pictures and documents that they have up there. In 1990, the commission concluded in a report that the Brabant Killers were most likely members or former members of security forces, probably gendarmerie, and that they either were involved in or had ties to right-wing extremist groups. These groups, the commission surmised, were operating under the protection of high-level politicians and officials that were attempting to implement their ideals within the government. The growing popularity of the Vlaams Blok and Vlaams Belang party throughout the late 1980s and 1990s fed validity into this claim, but it hasn't come up with any definitive link. Throughout the latter half of the 1980s, the investigation from Dendermonde, headed by Freddy Troke, began to focus on a couple of suspicious figures. Their main suspect, who Troke always felt strongly about, was a man who went by the name of Phillipe de Staercke. Phillipe was the son of a gypsy family who grew up in poverty. He had several siblings, mostly brothers, all of whom would go on to become criminals just like Phillipe. His older brother, Leon, became a famous thief in the 1970s, earning the nickname of the Little Leon. In the early 1980s, Phillipe de Staercke got involved in the underground drug scene. He became a drug dealer, ultimately having encounters with several notable figures in the local crime scene, including Patrick Haemers, a man I have mentioned in these episodes but haven't discussed as a Brabant suspect quite yet. On December 8, 1982, Phillipe de Staercke was arrested and later found guilty of theft in Antwerp. Over the next year or so, throughout a good chunk of 1983, Phillipe was behind bars. Of course, this would rule him out for most of the Brabant Killer assaults, but in December of 1983, Phillipe would take part in one of the biggest prison escapes in history. Called the Escape of the Century by the Belgian media, almost 40 prisoners managed to escape from a high-security facility. Phillipe returned to Brussels, but was arrested just 6 or so months later. He returned to prison to finish out his sentence, ultimately getting released on March 13, 1985. This release, much like another criminal story I've detailed on this podcast, was supposed to be a temporary release. In the story of the Alcácer girls, I detail how Spanish criminal Antonio Angles was released on a week-long reprieve, and he was later accused by the Spanish government of running off to commit the heinous crime of Alcácer. Well, once Phillipe de Staercke was released from prison, he fled. He returned to the Brussels area, where he set up a group of criminals that included his brothers and prior associates. The gang was now well-equipped and well-armed, and they apparently gained a connection by the name of Jean Bultot. Jean Bultot was the deputy director of a Belgian prison in St. Gilles. This prison was one which Phillipe de Staercke had been in during his incarceration, and Jean Bultot was known as being very lenient towards prisoners of his choosing. In fact, many former prisoners described Jean Bultot as being corrupt to the bone. He was not only an advocate of certain criminals, but he allegedly recruited them for future crimes. Bultot had ties to some of the extreme right-wing groups I've discussed throughout these episodes, and who also happened to be a gun fanatic. He owned a vast collection of firearms, which he kept not only at home, but in his vehicle and at work. Allegations have followed Bultot for years for having involvement in the pink ballets. the rumored sex orgies from the 1970s that involved underage girls and boys. Of course, this is just a long-standing rumor, not a fact. Rumors have also followed Bultot for helping organize armed robberies similar to that of the Brabant Killers. He would apparently hire out and contract Phillipe de Staercke's armed gang for some of these assaults, supplying them with weapons and ammunition for a cut of the proceeds. Some rumors have even alleged that Bultot took part in the robberies himself. Phillipe de Staercke, who was now a wanted fugitive, would later place himself in Aalst at the time in which the final Brabant Killer assault took place. Eyewitness reports have also put him in the area in the days and weeks preceding the attack, potentially scouting out the location. In November of 1985, just a week or so after the final Brabant Killer attack, Jean Bultot was arrested for the illegal possession of firearms. He was charged, but released a month or so later. He immediately fled to Paraguay, where he would remain until 1991. Phillipe de Staercke continued living a criminal lifestyle until March 6, 1986, when he was then arrested. Over a year later, in June of 1987, he was given a 20-year sentence for his various crimes. While imprisoned, Phillipe de Staercke and his accomplices would repeatedly state that Jean Bultot, the former deputy director of a Belgian prison, was involved in a right-wing plot to create an environment of terror. His goal, apparently, was to enlist the gang of Boss Road to hit department stores like the Brabant Killers, to continue spreading fear. No official ties have ever been made between this gang and the Brabant Killers, but again, it's just one coincidence too many. Jean Bultot would later be extradited back to Belgium in the early 1990s, after a major shakeup in the investigation happened. However, not much has been written about him since, so it's hard to tell how his tale ended up. But he's still alive and out there. Phillipe de Staercke was released from prison on July 12, 2001. He has remained out of the media for the past 15 years. The 1980s had all but come and gone, and it was nearing a decade since the Brabant Killers had first appeared in Belgium. In the final few months of 1990, a major change began to happen within the investigation. In October, the Minister of Justice, Melchior Wathelet, held a meeting with two highly placed investigative judges. Their discussion regarded the future of the investigation itself, and things seemed to have gone awry. A decision was handed down to strip the investigation away from the Dendermonde team, the only one that had gotten any results, and make the Charleroi investigation the centralized hub for the case. At the time, almost everyone involved in the Dendermonde investigation was stumped. Freddie Troke, the presiding judge in charge of the investigation, did not understand it himself. The decision just made no real sense. Many have wondered why exactly this change happened. The team in Dendermonde had been the ones to discover the weapons in November of 1986, and even though progress had been slow in the few years since, this Dutch team of investigators were eager to centralize the case and cooperate fully. Instead, it was being taken away from them and given to a new lead investigator that was relatively new to the job and had not handled any high-profile cases. Many have theorized, based on the content of the current investigation, that Freddie Troke and his team were sniffing around connections that higher-ups in the government did not want examined. They were apparently trying to uncover international connections, chasing rumors that some of the weapons had been purchased in America by associates such as Madani Bouhouche, Robert Beijer, and Jean Bultot. Either way, the investigation was being sent to the French-speaking district of Charleroi, under the eye of prosecutor Pierre Henné. Henné had replaced his predecessor in the Brabant case in February of that year, giving him just 8 months to catch up on a dossier that now stretched over 1 million pages long. That's how big the case file for the Brabant Killers was at that time, when you accounted for every piece of evidence, every suspect, every theory, just everything. Ever since then, it has doubled. This transition between departments was anything but seamless. The first meeting between the Dendermonde and Charleroi teams, in which the former was filling in the latter on all their recent progress and handing their case files over, was conducted without a translator. The two sides had a basic understanding of each other's language, but it's almost comical when you imagine one team of Dutch police trying to mimic their investigation to the French police. Then, to make matters worse, One of the ballistic experts for the newly christened Charleroi team came under fire when it turned out that he had no experience or credentials. He also had familial ties to organized crime, meaning that their ballistic work needed to start over from scratch. And if that wasn't enough, all of the case files from Dendermonde needed to be translated from Dutch to French. As I've said before, this was a case spanning millions of pages and documents. The translation became a matter of quantity over quality, and in that rushed process, several documents were translated poorly or not translated at all. And in that rushed process, several documents were translated poorly or not translated at all. Freddie Troke, the investigative judge from Dendermonde, was then further insulted the following year. After having the case stolen from him, he was then let go from his job in September of 1991. How, you may ask? Well, the local government in Dendermonde announced his resignation in a legal magazine, which he just so happened to have a subscription to. It wasn't until he read it in that periodical that he discovered he was out of a job. The casual pettiness in which the entire investigation was upended, which was only further compounded by the unprofessional way Troke was let go, severed all ties to the prior investigation. It seemed to show that the government officials in charge of the investigation wanted it done in a certain way, and any dissent would be treated in a similar fashion. The Minister of Justice responsible for the decision to split the investigation from Dendermonde, named Melchior Wathelet, later came under public scrutiny when it was discovered that he had shown leniency towards sex offenders like Marc Dutroux, who would later go on to become Belgium's most infamous serial killer. It forced Wathelet into early retirement and tarnished his reputation. Despite the dramatic turnover, the investigation would continue to trudge along. Several leads would come and go, including a man by the name of Patrick Haemers. This is a name I've now mentioned twice throughout this series. Patrick Haemers was well known for being tall and athletic, but also having fair features that made him attractive to many. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a build that would have made him an ideal candidate for the Giant. Just like many of the other men I've discussed over the past episode or two, Patrick Haemers had a history of drugs and violent crime. However, unlike them, he came from privilege. His father was a wealthy business owner, and Patrick wanted for nothing. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Patrick began to experiment with drugs. Because of this, he began to hang out with the wrong crowds, and he became immersed in the world of crime. In 1978, at the age of 25, Patrick was convicted to 3 years in prison for participating in the gang rape of a young woman. He spent just 14 months behind bars before being released, going right back to the criminal environment he had become associated with. He began to develop a cocaine addiction, which fueled his developing violent nature. He began cooperating with a partner named Phillipe de Staercke, and the two organized a band of criminals that would manage to last several years. The gang, which was named after the taller and more attractive Patrick, was really the brainchild of Phillipe de Staercke, who would prove himself resourceful and intelligent over the following years. The group mainly targeted armored transports, but they would diversify their targets so as to avoid suspicion. Then, they would use the proceeds from these robberies and, using businesses owned by them and their associates, found a way to properly launder the money without any hassle. For years, these criminals would strike their targets, constantly avoiding police intervention. However, the drug addiction of Patrick Haemers resulted in him becoming more rash and violent, ultimately culminating in an incident in November of 1985 that resulted in the deaths of 6 people. One of the members of this gang was found, months later, having committed suicide. Many believe that Patrick Haemers himself was involved in this death, considering that associate a loose end and framing it to look like he shot himself in the head. In 1987, police finally began to investigate Haemers, believing him to be involved in the long rash of armed transport robberies. He was arrested, and while being transported from one location to another to await trial, he was freed by accomplices. They had actually stopped the police transport and freed Patrick Haemers through gunfire, like it was a scene out of The Fast and the Furious. The escape was orchestrated by Phillipe Lecroix, proving his efficiency once again. Later, Philippe would state that he was worried about Patrick Haemers confessing their crimes and identities to police. From here, law enforcement began to theorize that Patrick Haemers had escaped the country. His partner Philippe and his wife fled to France, but Haemers became impossible to track down. However, this did not stop future cooperation between the two, as they were busy planning the crime of the century. In 1989, 2 years after his escape, rumors had circulated that the Patrick Haemers gang was active once again. They had continued their robbery of armored transports. But then, in January of 1989, they abducted the former Prime Minister of Belgium, Paul van den Boynants. It immediately became one of the biggest scandals in Belgian history, with the group fleeing to France and demanding a ransom of several tens of millions of dollars for the minister's release. With the minister held in a secret location, the gang continued to assault armored transports, eventually resulting in a payday that equaled $1.5 million. When the ransom of Minister Boynants went through, the gang then fled to South America, leaving behind evidence to point the police towards the BRS, the Brigade of Revolutionary Socialists, one of the many extremist organizations I have not mentioned throughout the series. After leaving Europe, law enforcement quickly pieced together who had actually committed this crime, and they began issuing Interpol warnings for the various figures involved. Patrick Haemers was discovered in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where he had fled with his girlfriend and infant son. Accompanying them were one of his many associates who had cooperated in the kidnapping and ransom of the former Belgian Prime Minister. Shortly thereafter, Haemers rolled over on his other accomplices, such as Philippe Lecroix and Basri Bajrami. They were correct after all, in guessing that he would easily flip on them, giving up their identities to law enforcement when questioned. All of the men responsible for the ransom were extradited back to Belgium, where they would prepare to stand trial for their assortment of crimes. This process, simply waiting for a trial, took its toll on Patrick Haemers. It would be almost 3 years in Belgian custody before the prospect of a trial began to formalize, and by then, Haemers had had enough. His accomplices had made an escape from prison, leaving him behind, and this seemed to crush his spirits entirely. Not to mention his drug dependency turned his prison life into a personal hell, the withdrawal process lasting months, if not years. On May 14th, 1993, Patrick Haemers committed suicide in prison, after tying the cord from a radio into a noose and hanging himself from the radiator in his room. In the years since, many have considered him to be one of the main suspects in the Brabant Killers strikes. His physical description would match up with that of the giant, and his laundry list of crimes and robberies sound very similar to those perpetrated by the 3 unknown gunmen. However, many expressed trepidation at outright naming Haemers a suspect. While the Brabant Killers were patient and careful in their planning, the crimes perpetrated by Patrick Haemers and his gang were pretty reckless. The abduction and ransom of the Belgian Prime Minister being just one such example. Police have operated under the assumption that Patrick Haemers and his associates, many of whom have served their sentences and since gone on to live lives outside of prison, may have committed more crimes than they are aware of. But as of the recording of this episode, none of those have been confirmed to have been Brabant Killer related. Throughout the first half of the 1990s, the investigation into the Brabant Killers continued along at a snail's pace. No real leads surfaced, or made any waves, at least until 1996. In 1996, 2 investigators were speaking to a reporter when they made casual mention of the identity of one of the bandits, nicknamed the Giant, being known to law enforcement. This comment, which was made in a very flippant manner, came off of the heels from a second parliamentary commission being made to investigate the Brabant Killers. Government officials, apparently disappointed with the Charleroi team's lack of progress, began to express a desire to obtain some kind of oversight. After all, it had now been over a decade since the gang's last attack, and the investigation had really gone nowhere. This was in June of 1996. If you are familiar at all with Belgian crime, then I'm sure you're familiar with a name that I've already mentioned in this series, Marc Dutroux. Marc Dutroux became synonymous with Belgian serial killers after his arrest in August of 1996. He had kidnapped, tortured, and raped 6 girls between 1995 and 1996. And this came off the heels of 5 similar attacks in the late 1980s. He had been convicted of the 1980s charges, but was let loose after 3 years of exhibiting good behavior behind bars. You may be wondering why I'm talking about Marc Dutroux in a series about the Brabant Killers. Well, it's because the arrest of Marc Dutroux in August of 1996, and the exposure of his many misdeeds, laid bare the faults of Belgian law enforcement. Police had had ample opportunity to not only stop Marc Dutroux's terrible behavior, but rescue some of the teenage girls he was holding captive in the basement of his home. You see, he was wanted for unrelated crimes at the time of these last kidnappings, and police had not done their due diligence in this investigation. Therefore, the lives of these final victims, who later starved to death in Dutroux's self-made torture chamber, were laid at the feet of law enforcement by the media and the public at large. Because of this outrage, the Second Parliamentary Commission into locating the Brabant Killers swayed directions in its early days. They began to focus less on armed bandits, like Madani, Bouhouche, and Patrick Haemers, and began to explore avenues of governmental corruption. This led the direction of the official inquiry into the avenue of pink ballets. Pink ballets, if you'll remember, are the alleged orgies and sex parties organized by high-ranking officials that may have served as a cover for illegal acts and organizations. This Second Parliamentary Commission alleged to have discovered some tentative links between victims of the Brabant Killers and these so-called pink ballets. They theorized, in their final conclusion, that these robberies may have just been an excuse to silence some individuals who either participated in highly classified talks regarding political dealings, or were witnesses that knew more than they should have. In this final conclusion, they published their thoughts about the Brabant Killers having links to the pink ballets, but made official the position of not having enough information and needing to further explore links to other gangs and criminal organizations. They also expressed the sentiment of needing to open up cooperation between law enforcement agencies. This final report, published in October of 1997, really says all you need to know about the Brabant Killer investigation. It had been over a decade, and the information was organized too chaotically, the investigation muddled by countless theories with not enough evidence to back them up, and it wasn't close to being over. In the over 20 years since this commission printed their final report, not much has changed. Many theories have come and gone in the years since the Second Parliamentary Commission. Without spending an entire episode getting into the nitty and gritty details of each, I'll try to summarize as best as I can. One theory points to the alleged weapons trade between two nations, Israel and Lebanon. In this theory, Belgium serves as the middleman between the two, while Israel supplies weapons and Lebanon provides drugs. This theory involves one of the victims of the Brabant Killers, named Leon Finet. Leon Finet was killed during the gang's 1985 attacks, having gone to the grocery store alone one night to fetch himself a newspaper. The Brabant Killers shot him at point-blank range in the back of the head, leading many to think that the robbery itself was conducted as a cover to just kill him. In addition to being a victim of the Brabant Killers, Leon Finet was also a banker with ties to many international banks. He was rumored to operate in the black market, as a sort of deal maker between interested parties. And before I get too deep into crazy conspiracy territory, I do want to state that allegations have been made that paint this man, Leon Finet, as a personal associate of not only Jose van den Einde, one of the first murder victims of the Brabant Killers from 1982, but also Jack Van Camp, the restaurant owner they killed in 1983. This Israel-Lebanon theory, which is much more complicated than anything I can describe, basically states that the Brabant Killers were interested in thinning out the black market for international guns. Several incarnations of this theory also include Juan Mendez, the 1986 victim of the killers, who worked as a sales manager for a large firearms manufacturer. And it also includes Angelou Constantine, the taxi driver the gang murdered in the early days of 1983. This theory also includes someone I have not covered throughout the past couple of episodes, a man by the name of Benoit de Bonvoisin. He is nicknamed the Black Baron, and for good reason. He is a far right-wing activist that has pushed right-wing causes for decades now. He has been accused of crimes ranging from fraud to embezzlement, and he has been tied to various extremist organizations for decades, including the Westland New Post. If you wish to learn more about this international theory, you can most definitely do so. But to be frank, it's a big bag of crazy that I don't really feel like dipping my toes in at the moment. It remains one of the most prevalent theories because of the number of players and general evidence pointing in its direction. There are a seemingly countless number of ties between this theory and the Brabant Killers, but I personally just don't know what to make of it. Another major theory plaguing this story is one called pressure and fear by many that subscribe to it. In this theory, a foreign entity has been working to destabilize Belgium for decades, if not since the end of World War II. For many, this foreign entity has been rumored to be one that I am personally familiar with. That is, of course, the United States government. Before you jump on me and call me a crazy person for simply addressing this theory, I would just like to point you to a couple of web searches you can make. The first is for something called a stay-behind network. The second is for something called Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio was a specific example of a stay-behind network, set in place in Italy to prevent a communist takeover. It was formed as a NATO-run operation, but mostly overseen by the CIA and other such government entities. The methods these operations were known to use included spreading misinformation, assassinating dangerous political figures, and preparing an armed resistance in case one was needed. Again, this isn't just borderline crazy person talk. I know it sounds like the basis for a spy movie, but Operation Gladio, just one such example of these so-called stay-behind networks, has its own Wikipedia page. The theory regarding pressure and fear stems from these stay-behind networks, that the Brabant Killers, perhaps government agents who had assimilated into Belgian culture, were tasked with trying to push the country in a certain direction. Many point to the time period that the Brabant Killers operated, the mid-1980s, as proof of this. That, perhaps at the time in which the Soviet Union looked poised to reinvent itself and continue its spread into Europe, that the Brabant Killers were tasked with closing the borders, so to speak, and trying to push the country into a further right-wing direction. After all, the Westland New Post organization had long had ties to government officials and higher-ups that backed their causes and pledged financial support. Paul Latinus, the leader of the WNP, had made claims to have the cooperation of foreign government agencies shortly before his suspicious suicide in April of 1984. Robert Beijer, the former partner of Madani Bouhouche and a former gendarme, also confessed to being paid by the Soviet Union to create discord within Belgium. Just like the Israeli-Lebanon theory, there are countless articles that could be read which paint the Brabant Killers as foreign agents hell-bent on creating chaos within Belgium. I don't claim to know all the ins and outs of this theory, but it is an interesting theory that should be considered when debating the purpose of the Brabant Killers and the various suspects, most of whom have ties to this theory. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, the investigation really didn't go anywhere. Despite the Brabant Killers becoming an impetus for major reform in law enforcement, police still had no answers as to their identities or motives. The police had the same non-existent answer when questioned about the missing or mishandled evidence, or the alleged ties between the Gang of Nivelles and government officials. There were no convictions or notable arrests until 2014. On May 12, 2014, a 68-year-old man by the name of Jean-Marie Tinck was arrested after allegedly confessing to having some involvement in the now 30-year-old crime spree. Jean-Marie, a former sailor, had confessed to patrons in a French pub about knowing the identity of the Brabant Killers. This led to further confessions over time, in which his involvement in the crimes, and knowledge of the participants, continued to increase with each telling. Eventually, Jean-Marie told one of the witnesses about the gang's 1985 assault in Overijse. This is the attack in which a handful of people were killed, including a child. Jean-Marie Tinck's recounting of the crimes included a detailed description of the way in which this child had died. These were details that had not been publicly released, so police theorized that this information must have come from somewhere. Arrested in May, Jean-Marie Tinck would be released 2 months later, on July 10th. All of the charges had been dropped, after police failed to turn up any evidence. Tinck had submitted to a polygraph, had his DNA compared to the records on file, had his home searched, and had his communications scoured in an attempt to find any link. This man's lawyer contested that this was all a huge misunderstanding, that Jean-Marie Tinck suffered from a mental instability that resulted in him trying to talk himself up to others. A day after his release, Jean-Marie Tinck granted an interview with a news station in which he confessed to being a habitual liar and having some mental deficiencies. He lied about being a soldier to others, but during this interview, he confessed to having killed another man in hand-to-hand combat. Very odd behavior, but not incriminating when it came to the ongoing investigation. However, Jean-Marie Tinck did let slip a new sliver of information: that most of what he told during these drunk confessions came from a man he met in 1995 while in prison. According to Jean-Marie, quote, "This man knew a lot," unquote. Nonetheless, after years of having no new information, interest was again sparked in the case of the Brabant Killers. This newfound surge of energy into the investigation was much needed, as the police in charge of the case were running out of time. You see, in Belgium, there exists a very particular statute of limitations. The time period in which the Brabant Killers could have been identified and charged for the crimes was 15 years. 15. I know, that's not nearly enough time for a series of crimes as brutal and heartless as they committed. So, Belgian law was changed to allow for the statute of limitations to be renewed. Once. So, by the time the first deadline was approaching in November of 2000, the deadline was renewed throughout 2015. If you're keeping tabs, at this point in the investigation, police had a little over a year to make some headway in the investigation before this second time period expired. The confessions and arrest of Jean-Marie Tinck in May of 2014 helped reignite some public curiosity into the crimes of the Belgian Mad Killers. For many, they had not even heard of the criminals, their attacks now 30 years old. In October of 2014, the former second-in-command of the Westland New Post, Michael Liebert, was brought in for questioning. The WNP, a far right-wing extremist organization constantly tied to theories regarding the Brabant Killers, had long since been defunct. This questioning seemed to be purely exploratory, with Liebert being released less than 24 hours later. But it showed that police were finally following up on some older leads, perhaps starting the investigation anew. As 2014 led into 2015, anticipation grew in regards to the Brabant Killers. Many feared that the police were going to try and rush an entire investigation, charging a couple of men for the crimes in the hopes that they could get at least a conviction. Others worried that the case would go unsolved through the statute of limitations deadline, resulting in a perpetual cold case that police could no longer investigate. However, at the very last minute of 2015, a resolution was passed which allowed the investigation of the Brabant Killers to continue. It gave the police another decade to try and solve the case, but showcased how sloppy the investigation really was. They were still relying on last-minute deadlines to encourage any kind of progress in the case. At least there is that silver lining. As of the recording of this episode, the police still have close to another decade to try and solve the case, until the next deadline is set to expire in 2025, at the least. In 2016, a long-rumored suspect passed away. Michael Koku was a former Brussels area policeman and a member of the Beijer, a group I spoke about in prior episodes. Despite evidence leading to his release, police and the media had long suspected Koku of having involvement in the violent Brabant crimes. He passed away in December of 2016, after another year of inactivity. At this point, the public had long grown apathetic to any updates by the investigators. The most disgusted at the lack of progress, however, remained the victims of the Brabant Killers and their loved ones. Over the span of 30 years, these victims and their surviving family had received no type of compensation, care, or support from the government. When the investigation went through its infamous 1991 turnover, in which the joint investigation was stripped from the only precinct that had made any progress and given to an inexperienced prosecutor, the survivors and their families received only one letter from the local government. This letter did not explain why the change was happening, or offer any kind of sympathy to the turmoil the victims had gone through. Over time, this had led to passive-aggressive rage on behalf of the victims. They had been kept out of the loop when it came to the investigation, which remained one of the biggest and most public in Belgian history. At this point, in 2016, the survivors had long since moved on with their lives. Many continued their cries for justice, but others just found it hard to care anymore. Some of these survivors went public in 2015, arguing for the investigation to just be closed once and for all. Quote, "Do you think you'll find something after 40 years if you haven't found it after 30 years?" Unquote. A lawyer for a handful of families argued, petitioning for the investigation to be shuttered once and for all. The victims and their families argued that every new lead inspired hope, but opened wounds which had never truly healed. Said one survivor, speaking to authorities, quote, "I do not believe in justice, and I have no respect for you. You do not do your job." Unquote. Those that still demanded justice would not yield, however. Among those is David Vandenstein, who was a young boy when his family was attacked in the final Aalst assault in 1985. Quote, "They were barbarians that shot children in the face. They caused carnage. If you have seen that with your own eyes. Even today I could see the scars on my leg." Unquote. David, who was just 9 years old in 1985, was shot alongside his family during the assault on the Delhaize supermarket. His older sister and parents were all killed by the Brabant Killers, and David was taken in by his grandparents. His wounds, which included a very serious leg injury, required over 33 surgeries throughout the next year. He wasn't released from the hospital until August of 1986, almost a year after the attack took place. Even today, he requires weekly therapy, and the pain has become a constant in his life. At the age of 13, he even attempted suicide when the pain started to become too much to bear. After the death of his immediate family, David continued his education and worked alongside his grandfather and uncle to keep his father's business alive. Throughout his hardworking and painful life, he has managed to do just that. Keep the memory of his parents alive in the form of the business they had worked so hard to create. Even when he can't stand for very often, because the pain in his leg persists, he continues to be an inspiration to those around him. Not only that, but David went on to publish a book alongside a local journalist. This book details David's recovery from that Aalst attack, and how he has worked to not only improve himself from that lowest of lows, losing his entire family and attempting to kill himself, but become an advocate for the victims and survivors of the Brabant attacks. This book is now being turned into a feature film, which will be released in 2018. David has remained active throughout the investigation, speaking out against Patrick Haemers, the tall, handsome criminal who is charged with abducting the former Belgian Prime Minister. He once claimed that Haemers is the man who shot him and his family in the 1985 attack, but has since gone on to insist that the gang was not a static group. His own theory about the Brabant Killers is that it was a roaming band of men who used the same weapons and tactics to conduct their illegal operations. This, he theorizes, is why the descriptions of the gunmen varied from case to case. David Vandenstein remains an advocate for justice, arguing that even if it takes 50 years to find the Brabant Killers, he wants all of them to be punished for their actions. This is originally where I planned to end my series on the Brabant Killers. But, as luck would have it, major news regarding this story surfaced while I was researching and preparing these episodes. The news broke a week or so before Halloween, this year in 2017. The brother of a former gendarme police officer had spoken to police about his brother potentially being one of the Brabant Killers. Christian Bonkowski, most commonly called Chris by those that knew him, was a gendarme police officer for several decades. Born in 1952, he joined the police force in 1972, eventually earning a reputation for being an effective officer. In 1977, he was enlisted to participate in the Diane Brigade, which, as I've told you about, was a paramilitary anti-terror operation created in the wake of the Munich Olympics. Bonkowski had two brothers in the local gendarmerie police forces, and seemed to take great pride in his work. He was a part of something profound, being on the front lines of the nation's efforts to combat terrorism. However, this pride was relatively short-lived. In the early 1980s, after an incident involving the accidental discharge of his weapon, he was let go from the Diane Brigade and sent back to the normal gendarmerie police force. The details of this incident are unconfirmed, but an informant who claims to have been there at the time recalls Chris Bonkowski being, in so many words, a dumbass. He was twirling a pistol around his finger like he was a gunslinger, and the gun accidentally went off. He apparently missed a colleague of his by mere inches, and once he actually grabbed a hold of the gun, he discharged it once again into the area of his foot. I can't really find out whether he shot himself or not, but he would have issues walking later on, which I will go into. After this accident, Bonkowski was let go from Diane and sent back to work in the Alst area for the gendarmes. If you recall, this is the town in which the final, and most violent, Brabant Killer assault took place. This dismissal seemed to have hit Christian Bonkowski rather hard. It was at this point that he began developing an alcohol addiction, which would plague him for the rest of his life. Many think this may have also contributed to the Brabant assaults, with Bonkowski wanting to steal wine and liquor. Colleagues of Bonkowski describe him as being a little bit of a talker. He was a guy that liked to talk himself up, make him seem like a bigger deal than he actually was. This also fed into his obsession of firearms and martial arts, which he was also apparently a big fan of. However, despite this obsession with being seen as macho, nobody really recalls him as being a good shot or a physically imposing individual. He was tall, that much was sure. If you look up pictures of Christian Bonkowski, you'll notice that he's about a head taller than everyone around him. There wasn't much muscle on him, but the man was tall. It does make sense why he would earn the nickname of the Giant from witnesses, if he was indeed a part of the Brabant Killers. The ex-wife of Christian Bonkowski, who married him in the early 1980s and would divorce him just a few years later, described him as being an angry person, who may or may not have had both violent and racist viewpoints. In 1998, the name of Christian Bonkowski was forwarded to the Charleroi investigators in charge of the Brabant Killer case file. They reviewed the suspicions and took a saliva and fingerprint sample from Chris. They never actually questioned him regarding the Brabant Killers, despite theories circulating at the time regarding gendarme involvement in the crimes. His saliva was tested against DNA found from two different crime scenes: a cigarette butt found in the taxicab belonging to murder victim Angelou Constantine in 1983, and a partial DNA sample found on a bulletproof vest recovered from a creek bed in 1986. The DNA test came back negative, and the fingerprint tests were inconclusive. Police would drop him as a suspect entirely. His name had been brought to the attention of police by a concerned friend of his, who had begun to suspect Chris of involvement in the crimes. He had initially been disturbed by the other man's talk in the 1980s, after being let go by the Diane Brigade, of wanting to tear down the police system in revenge. He had made comments of staging a, quote, coup d'etat, and when police released new eyewitness sketches of the gang of Nivelles, this acquaintance got really concerned. In 2001, a caravan belonging to Christian Bonkowski burned down. This caravan, which was located in a town called Serfontaine, appeared to be the target of arson, but the investigation would falter before it actually went anywhere. Police never came across many leads, despite Bonkowski having been wanting to make the caravan his retirement home. Chris Bonkowski continued to work for the Alst police force until 2010. This means that many of the police officers working there today have had some kind of a relationship with him, as either a mentor or a colleague. In 2015, Christian Bonkowski was on his deathbed and apparently confessed to one of his brothers that he was the Giant from the infamous Brabant Killer attacks. This brother didn't immediately tell authorities, thinking that this might have been just another example of his brother trying to make him seem like more important than he actually was. But he eventually spoke about this confession to an acquaintance of his, who then got in touch with survivor David Van de Steen, who had remained an advocate of the case for many years. From here, David Van de Steen would report this confession to authorities in February of 2017. In October of 2017, police went to the press with this information, believing it to be valid. They had made contact with Bonkovsky's brother, who confirmed hearing the confession come from his deceased brother 2 years beforehand. Quote, "In the beginning I was in denial because I really struggled with it, but today I can say formally that this is my brother." Unquote. The evidence against Christian Bonkovsky is pretty striking. Outside of his overall description, standing 1.9 meters, tall and lean, occasionally wearing a mustache, he had the demeanor for the crimes. He was paramilitary, having spent half a decade in one of Belgium's most prestigious law enforcement agencies. He had training not accessible by many outside of these units, and he was well aware of how the local police force would respond to any incidents bordering on terrorism, such as the Brabant Killers. When police looked through the evidence linking Bonkovsky to the crimes, they also noticed that on the days after many of the Brabant Killer assaults, he had taken a vacation day off. This also happened to coincide with a medical leave he had taken in September of 1985, just a day before the Brabant Killers resurfaced with attacks in Braine-l'Alleud and Overijse. He took his leave for an ankle injury on September 26th. The Brabant Killers attacked for the first time in almost 2 years the very next day, on September 27th. Then, in November of 1985, Chris Bonkovsky had taken 2 months off of his duty for a broken ankle. Many think that this would rule him out for the final, brutal November 9th assault. But many witnesses recall seeing the giant walking with a noticeable limp. Only time will tell whether this information leads to any answers or convictions. But the news of Chris Bonkovsky's potential involvement in the attacks of De Binde van Nieuwel has provoked serious changes in the investigation. Committee P, the nickname given to the Permanent Oversight Committee on the Police Services, has begun to officially investigate ties between the gendarmerie and the Brabant Killers. The ties they are investigating are something that would have been seen as just a part of a random conspiracy theory months ago, implying that there is still plenty left to uncover in this case. Every bit of news tying the crimes to the gendarme police force are being examined, including the links between the ammunition used by the killers and a shooting club located in Aalst, which Christian Bonkovsky visited regularly. In the weeks after the news broke, police received over 100 solid tips, which are now helping them unearth information hidden away decades ago. Patricia Finney, the daughter of Brabant victim Leon Finney, says it best. Quote, "I really hope that this will lead to dismantling the rest of the group, whether they are dead or not." Unquote. As of this episode's recording, police have yet to make any charges stick against Brabant Killer suspects. Madani Bouhouche, Robert Beijer, Jean Bultot, Pierre Corrette, Patrick Haemers, Christian Bonkovsky, Michael Liebert, Phillipe de Staercke. By this point, these are all just names to you. I'm sure that many of them blend into one another, making them just a series of scumbags that plagued the area of Brussels in the mid-1980s. It's possible that none of them are guilty of the crimes committed by the Mad Killers of Belgium. However, it is also possible that at least one of them, if not several, was involved. This is not only because of their proximity to the crimes, but by their violent natures which have been exposed in the following years. The current investigation, which seems to have focused on the most recent news, still has to pay for decades of inactivity. Leads that might have been solid 30 years ago have since dried up, but that has not stopped the gears of justice from spinning. Police remain convinced that the answer lies out there, just waiting to be discovered. There are still another 8 or so years until the statute of limitations evaporate on the various crimes committed by the Brabant Killers. The DNA profile of one of the killers has been established, based off of forensics discovered at the multiple crime scenes. To date, that DNA has not been matched with any known suspects, but that could change on any given day. What we know about the Brabant Killers, also called the Mad Killers of Belgium and De Bende van Nieuwel, has not changed in some time. They were cold-blooded murderers who seemed better at killing innocent, defenseless individuals than they were at stealing. Throughout their 24 attacks, they killed at least 28 people and wounded 40 more, stealing a grand total of maybe $200,000 over the span of 3 years. Survivors noted their apparent glee at killing people. This was most notable during their final attack. They seemed to thrive off of fighting an unfair battle, waging war on an unsuspecting populace. A €250,000 reward exists for information that will lead to the discovery or capture of the Brabant Killers. For a time, they existed as boogeymen, a story parents would tell their kids to get them to come home before bedtime. But an entire generation has been born and raised to adulthood since the Brabant Killers last struck. And in that time, new nightmares and terrors of the night have since come and gone. Their name, which changes depending on your location, has become just a relic of a day gone by. The thing that has not faded away, though, is the need for answers. The public, the victims, the survivors, law enforcement itself, they all clamor for it. Only time will tell whether old leads or new updates will lead to those answers. Until such time, the story of the Brabant Killers remains unresolved. Thank you all for listening to the Unresolved podcast. The Brabant Killers is one of those stories that I've wanted to tackle for a while now. I think I first learned about the story in the early half of 2017, and I honestly just thought, I wondered how it wasn't one of the biggest mysteries of all time. I mean, with all the shootings, the conspiracies, the theories, it's massive. It just blows my mind that it's not as big as like Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac. I know that some of you are annoyed with me doing these longer, multi-part stories, but rest assured I'm going to be taking a break from those for the next month or so. I want to focus on some smaller stories to hopefully raise awareness, and that's what you'll be getting for the next few weeks. In case you weren't aware, I have actually begun pursuing the podcast as a full-time gig, which is really exciting for me and hopefully exciting for you. If you would like to support this little endeavor of mine to get episodes of Unresolved out on a weekly basis, you could head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to become a patron. I've finally begun shipping out stickers, magnets, and t-shirts, and I've even started recording some little behind-the-scenes episodes with some cool bonus content. So if you're interested in any of that, or voting for future episodes, or even just participating in a more hands-on basis, you could head to the Patreon to do just that. Of course, you could also head to the podcast website, which is unresolved.me, and you could find a link to the PayPal account there. This way you could help financially support the podcast without having to worry about the whole rigmarole of Patreon. If you enjoy the podcast but don't necessarily have any extra money to spare, I would really appreciate if you could head to iTunes and leave a positive rating and review for the podcast. I know it seems silly, but those 5-star ratings really do go a long way. They'd really help me on the business end of the podcast, and if you could just do that, that would be awesome. Thank you for that. If you're interested in finding out more information about the podcast, or getting in touch with me, you could head to the podcast official website, which is unresolved.me. There you could also find links to social media, which can be found at UnresolvedPod for both Facebook and Twitter. I've been debating getting an Instagram, but haven't done that quite yet. You could also send in any emails to theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com or to michael@unresolved.me. And just for the record, that's Michael with the E before the A. Don't blame me, blame my parents. And if you want to call in and leave a voicemail or text, you could do so at 831-200-3550. I think that's about it for me, but I do really appreciate all of you giving the Unresolved podcast a listen. Thank you for all of your support and your kind words and everything as I begin this transition to making the podcast a regular thing. Honestly, just listening is awesome. So everyone out there, if you're listening to me say this right now, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Next week, I will be back with a standalone episode, which will probably be one of the saddest episodes of the podcast yet. So, yeah, happy holidays, everyone. Talk to you later.